Before horror moved into the suburbs or the vacuum of space, it lived in the soil, the ancient woods, and the isolated communities that never quite left the old ways behind. This is folk horror, a subgenre that finds terror not in the unknown, but in the forgotten traditions and the heavy silence of the rural landscape. Tonight, we're exploring the occult ritual and the folk horror boom. We're tracing the lineage of the unholy, where the isolation of the countryside becomes a breeding ground for paranoia and pagan devotion. These are films where the landscape itself is a character, and the laws of modern society are replaced by the cruel, arbitrary demands of ancient gods. From the silent visionary heresy of the 1920s to the peak of the British unholy trinity and the psychedelic cult cinema of the 1970s, these stories remind us that some secrets are buried for a reason.
Eyes of Fire, 1983. A disgraced preacher leads a small group of settlers away from their community and into unclaimed woodland, hoping isolation will offer a new beginning. Instead, the forest itself becomes the defining presence, dense, watchful, and resistant to intrusion. Long before the threat is explained, the land feels inhabited. Faith guides the group forward, but uncertainty begins to erode conviction as strange figures appear between trees and distant voices echo at night. The colonial setting grounds the story in survival and belief, with tension rising from both environmental danger and spiritual doubt. Shot on location in Missouri forests, the film relies on natural light, shifting shadows and environmental sound to create unease. Supernatural manifestations are brief and often ambiguous, blending with branches, fog, and darkness rather than standing apart from them. As the settlers push deeper into territory that does not welcome them, the boundary between spiritual fear and physical threat becomes increasingly difficult to separate, leaving the forest itself as the story's most persistent presence. Witchfinder General, 1968. Set against the lawless backdrop of the English Civil War, the film follows Matthew Hopkins, a corrupt lawyer who travels the countryside appointing himself Witchfinder General. Capitalizing on religious hysteria, Hopkins and his sadistic assistant extract confessions through torture, charging terrified villages for their services. After Hopkins targets a young woman, her fiancé, a soldier in Cromwell's cavalry, embarks on a relentless, blood-soaked quest for vengeance that threatens to destroy his own humanity. Directed by the brilliant but tragic 24-year-old Michael Reeves, the film is a brutal masterpiece of folk horror. Reeves eschewed the camp style popular in 1960s genre cinema, demanding a gritty, historical realism. He famously clashed with Vincent Price on set, forcing the horror icon to drop his usual theatrical flourishes in favor of a cold, calculated, and genuinely terrifying performance as Hopkins. The stark sunlit cinematography of the English countryside stands in disturbing contrast to the graphic, visceral violence of the narrative. Witchfinder General remains a devastating critique of institutional corruption and the way fanaticism thrives during wartime collapse. It presents a world where the monsters are entirely human, driven by greed and sadism, rather than supernatural forces. The film's harrowing, screaming finale is one of the most uncompromising endings in British cinema. It is a haunting, beautifully shot historical nightmare that stands as a definitive text on the horrors of religious persecution. Vi, 1967. The first officially sanctioned Soviet horror film adapts Nikolai Gogol's story about Koma, a seminary student ordered to spend 3 nights praying over the body of a young woman who may have been a witch. Each night, supernatural forces become more intense as spirits, monsters, and the imposing figure known as Vi test the limits of Koma's resolve. His only protection is a chalk circle drawn around him, a barrier that becomes increasingly fragile as the nights progress. Directors Konstantin Yershov and Georgy Kropatchev create rich atmosphere within Soviet filmmaking restrictions. The church setting, with its shadows, candles, and heavy iconography, produces genuine tension. The first 2 nights rely on building unease, while the third unleashes a memorable array of practical effects and creature designs that remain impressive today. Leonid Kuravlyov brings a blend of fear, bravado, and exhaustion to Coma, making his unraveling believable. Natalia Varley portrays the young woman in both her living and spectral forms, and the transformation is handled with strong makeup work for the period. The film's finale became one of the most iconic sequences in Eastern European genre cinema. Vi retains a distinct identity by grounding its supernatural elements in regional folklore rather than generic horror imagery, ensuring its place as a landmark of Soviet-era filmmaking. Race with the Devil, 1975. Two couples on a recreational RV trip through rural Texas witness a satanic sacrifice in a remote field. When they report what they saw, the local authorities dismiss their claims. But the cultists have no intention of letting witnesses escape. What begins as a vacation quickly becomes a high-speed chase through the Southwest, with devil worshippers closing in from every direction. Directed by Jack Starrett, Race with the Devil is one of the most effective occult thrillers of the 70s, a film that weaponizes American paranoia about rural outsiders and combines it with action movie pacing. The genius of the premise is its simplicity. Nowhere is safe. Anyone could be involved, and the hero's best asset is their mobility. Peter Fonda and Warren Oates anchor the film, with easy camaraderie and mounting desperation. They're not action heroes or investigators, just regular guys who made the mistake of seeing something they shouldn't have. Loretta Swit and Lara Parker complete the quartet, playing capable partners rather than screaming victims. The group dynamic feels authentic. The cultists are genuinely menacing. Not theatrical Satanists, but everyday people who could be gas station attendants, mechanics, or local sheriffs. The film's paranoia comes from this ordinariness. The creeping realization that the conspiracy might be everywhere. The climax delivers one of horror's more nihilistic endings, refusing to provide easy resolution or safety. Race with the Devil taps into deep American anxieties about the unknown spaces between cities and what might be happening there, and it does so with relentless efficiency. Häxan, 1922. Part documentary, part horror dramatization, this unusual film explores the history of witchcraft and superstition through staged scenes and scholarly commentary. Directed by Benjamin Christensen, it recreates medieval beliefs about demons, possession, and ritual practices with elaborate effects for its time. The imagery includes devils, sabbaths, and visions of torment that were considered shocking on release and still feel bold today. It moves between lecture-style explanation and surreal visual storytelling, creating a structure that feels decades ahead of its era. The film blends education and horror in a way that still feels experimental. Because of its structure and graphic imagery, it faced censorship and restricted releases in multiple countries. Modern viewers often see it as both film history and proto-horror spectacle. It stands as one of the strangest and most ambitious dark films of the silent period. The Wicker Man, 1973. A police sergeant travels to a remote Scottish island to investigate reports of a missing girl. He arrives expecting cooperation, but quickly finds a community that operates by entirely different rules. Christianity has no place here. Pagan rituals are practiced openly. Sexuality is treated casually, and ancient traditions guide daily life. The locals are polite but evasive, answering questions just enough to keep the investigation moving without revealing too much. As the island prepares for its May Day celebrations, the case begins to feel less like a search and more like a test. The film is driven by contrast rather than mystery. Edward Woodward plays Sergeant Howie as disciplined, sincere, and unwavering in his beliefs. His faith isn't portrayed as foolish, it's simply incompatible with the culture he's entered. Christopher Lee appears as Lord Summerisle, the island's leader, calm and persuasive rather than overtly threatening. He speaks with certainty, not malice, which makes the situation more unsettling as it unfolds. Much of the tension comes from atmosphere. The island feels lived in and functional, not sinister on the surface. Songs, dances, and seasonal rituals are presented as everyday life rather than warning signs. Paul Giovanni's folk music runs throughout the film, sometimes cheerful, sometimes uneasy, blurring the line between celebration, and menace. There's very little reliance on effects or shock. Unease builds through behavior and belief. The Wicker Man moves toward an ending that feels both surprising and inevitable. It's a film about conviction, isolation, and what happens when belief systems collide without compromise. Quiet, methodical, and deeply uncomfortable, it leaves its impact through ideas rather than spectacle, and lingers because of it. The Devil, 1972. If you are looking for a film that feels less like a traditional horror movie and more like a fever dream captured on celluloid, Andrzej Żuławski's The Devil is essential viewing. Set in 1793 during the Prussian invasion of Poland, it follows a young nobleman named Jakub, who is rescued from a prison riot by a mysterious black-clad stranger. This stranger acts as a twisted guide, escorting Jakub across a war-torn landscape where he finds that his home has devolved into a nightmare of betrayal, incest, and suicide. It is a punishing, unrelenting piece of cinema that operates on the logic of a panic attack. What makes this film truly remarkable and notoriously difficult is its sheer, unbridled intensity. Żuławski, who would later gain cult fame for Possession, directs with a chaotic, kinetic energy that makes the camera feel like an active participant in the character's madness. The performances, particularly from Wojciech Psoniak as the malevolent stranger, are pitched at an extreme, almost operatic volume. It is a deeply political film masked as a gothic horror, serving as a scathing allegory for the repression and social collapse of the era in which it was produced. Banned by the Polish government for 15 years following its completion, The Devil remains a landmark of transgressive cinema. It abandons standard narrative pacing in favor of a relentless, spiraling descent into nihilism, where the distinction between the devil's influence and the protagonist's own fractured psyche becomes increasingly blurred. This is not popcorn horror by any stretch of the imagination. It is an exhausting, visceral experience that demands the viewer's absolute attention. If you want a film that pushes the boundaries of what the medium can express in terms of raw psychological pain, this is a masterpiece of the genre. Lair of the White Worm, 1988. On the rolling hills of rural England, an ancient evil slithers just beneath the surface. When an archaeology student unearths a massive snake-like skull, he stumbles onto a legend that refuses to stay buried. The discovery awakens the lingering presence of the Dampton worm, a mythical serpent tied to local folklore, and to the seductive, terrifying Lady Sylvia Marsh. With her fangs, her charm, and her devotion to dark ritual, she embodies the danger of the past bleeding into the present. Lair of the White Worm is the kind of horror that delights in its strangeness. Directed by Ken Russell, the film embraces camp, surrealism, and bold sexuality while never losing its menacing edge. Lady Sylvia, played with wicked glee by Amanda Donohoe, steals the spotlight as a villainess who is as alluring as she is horrifying. Her every scene drips with both menace and charisma, making her one of the most unforgettable figures in late 80s horror. The film's visuals are striking. Hypnotic dream sequences bathed in lurid color, serpentine imagery winding through every frame, and a countryside setting that feels both idyllic and cursed. Russell pushes the boundaries of what a cult horror film can be, blending gothic tradition with outrageous modern flair. Beneath the excess, the story explores the power of myth, how ancient fears survive in stories and symbols, and how easily they can coil around us when given the chance. It's part monster movie, part fever dream, and entirely its own creature. Lair of the White Worm may not be a conventional horror film, but that's its strength. It's weird, daring, and unforgettable, a film that crawls under your skin and stays there, equal parts fright and fascination. The Brotherhood of Satan, 1971. Bernard Mickey's The Brotherhood of Satan traps travelers in a small California town where children are disappearing and adults are dying in bizarre accidents that seem to involve toys come to life. As the protagonists investigate, they discover a satanic coven of elderly townspeople attempting to achieve immortality by transferring their souls into the children's bodies through occult ritual. The film's premise is genuinely unsettling. Senior citizens as satanic cultists, using innocent children for supernatural life extension. Strother Martin leads the Coven with quiet menace, playing the group's leader as someone who believes absolutely in what they're doing. The elderly cultists aren't cackling villains, but desperate people facing mortality and choosing damnation over death. The practical effects for the toy-related deaths are creatively executed. A man crushed by a giant toy tank, others killed by oversized dolls and soldiers. These sequences blend dark whimsy with genuine horror, transforming childhood objects into instruments of occult violence. The children themselves are portrayed as innocent victims, slowly falling under the Coven's influence through rituals and conditioning. The small-town setting creates effective isolation. Our protagonists can't leave, and outside help seems impossibly distant. The community's complicity, whether through fear or active participation, makes trust impossible. The film's low budget forces creativity in staging the supernatural elements, using suggestion and careful framing rather than elaborate effects. The Brotherhood of Satan represents early 70s occult horror finding American voice, blending satanic panic with folk horror isolation. It's modest but effective genre filmmaking that takes its premise seriously while delivering creative scares and genuine unease about community secrets and the corruption of innocence. The Mephisto Waltz, 1971. If you have a soft spot for the satanic high society subgenre that dominated the early 70s, the Mephisto Waltz is arguably the classiest entry you're going to find. It stars Alan Alda as a journalist who strikes up a friendship with a wealthy, aging concert pianist, played with deliciously sinister charisma by Kurt Jurgens, only to get pulled into the old man's orbit. The story is a slow, methodical burn that reveals the pianist isn't just a fan of the occult, he's looking for a vessel, and Alda is the prime candidate. What makes this film particularly effective is how it prioritizes mood and psychological claustrophobia over traditional creature effects. Director Paul Wendkos handles the pacing with a cold, surgical precision, making the transition from a standard character drama to a supernatural nightmare feel almost seamless. The film is dripping with high-end, 70s decadence. Think sprawling mansions, eerie classical music, and a pervasive sense of dread that lingers long after the credits roll. It's a masterclass in atmospheric tension, proving that you don't need a huge budget to make a film feel genuinely menacing. The performances really anchor the whole experience, especially Jacqueline Bisset, who plays Alda's wife. She brings a grounded, frantic intensity to her role that serves as the perfect foil to the surreal events unfolding around them. It is a stylish, cynical piece of filmmaking that takes the Rosemary's Baby blueprint and gives it a slightly more cynical, piano-fueled twist. For anyone who appreciates horror that feels like a polished, upscale nightmare, this is a quintessential watch that rarely gets the credit it deserves. The Seventh Victim, 1943. Mary Gibson, Kim Hunter in her screen debut, leaves her boarding school to travel to New York City in search of her missing older sister, Jacqueline. Her investigation leads her into a dark, shadowy world within Greenwich Village, where she uncovers evidence of her sister's connection to an underground satanic cult. As Mary peels back the layers of Jacqueline's life, including a secret marriage and sessions with a psychiatrist, she realizes that the cult considers Jacqueline a traitor who must be silenced. The film is a masterpiece of chiaroscuro lighting and atmospheric suspense. Every frame, from the subway tunnels to the dimly lit apartments of the village, is composed with a stifling, claustrophobic intent. The narrative doesn't follow the tidy beats of a standard detective story. It moves with the disorienting, dreamlike quality of a nightmare, where the mystery is less about who done it and more about the tragic inevitability of the characters' fates. Technically, the film is a showcase for the Luton touch, the ability to create genuine terror on a shoestring budget by prioritizing lighting, sound, and psychological suggestion over expensive special effects. The famous shower scene, a tension-filled moment of vulnerability, is often cited as a precursor to the suspense-driven horror that would define the genre in later decades. This is a film that refuses to offer an easy resolution. It is a stark, poetic meditation on death, where the ultimate tragedy isn't the presence of the cult, but the isolation and despair that allow such shadows to flourish. For those who view 1940s horror as merely spooky castles and monsters, the seventh victim is a sobering, intellectual, and deeply unsettling revelation. Alucarda, 1977. Alucarda, directed by Juan López Moctezuma in 1977, is one of the most hallucinatory and intense entries in VHS-era horror. The story takes place in a remote convent, where two young women, Alucarda and Justine, forge a bond that quickly spirals into dark obsession. Their curiosity and defiance awaken a malevolent supernatural force that infects the convent with chaos, blood, and ritualistic terror. The film thrives on its surreal, operatic visuals. Every frame is saturated with color and shadow, from blood-soaked ceremonies to candlelit corridors that twist and bend in ways that feel almost dreamlike. Alucarda herself is a force of nature, beautiful, chaotic, and terrifying. Her presence transforms the convent into a place where the lines between innocence and evil, love and destruction, are blurred beyond recognition. What sets Alucarda apart is how it combines traditional horror with transgressive themes. It explores repression, religious fanaticism, and forbidden desire, creating tension that is both psychological and visceral. The convent becomes a prison, and the girl's growing connection with darkness adds a sense of inevitability to the carnage that unfolds. For fans of strange, ambitious horror, Alucarda is a cult treasure. It's a film that's as unnerving as it is hypnotic, offering a VHS-era experience where imagery, atmosphere, and shock collide. By the end, viewers are left both mesmerized and unsettled, reminded of a time when horror could be unapologetically wild, surreal, and unforgettable. The Blood on Satan's Claw, 1971. Piers Haggard's The Blood on Satan's Claw is British folk horror set in 17th century rural England, where a ploughman unearths something ancient and malevolent in the fields. As a demonic presence spreads through the village, the local youth fall under its influence, forming a cult, committing atrocities, and slowly transforming as the demon reclaims physical form through their corruption. The film captures genuinely disturbing atmosphere through its rural setting and period detail. This isn't Gothic castle horror, but earthbound evil emerging from the soil itself, corrupting a farming community through its children. Linda Hayden delivers an unsettling performance as the cult's leader, a teenage girl whose transformation from innocent to predatory feels organic and terrifying. Patrick Wymark brings authority as the judge who recognizes demonic influence and takes extreme measures to stop it. The practical effects for the demon's gradual manifestation, clawed limbs, fur-covered skin, inhuman features appearing on young bodies, are effectively disturbing. The violence has real weight, particularly sequences involving the cult's attacks on those who resist or discover their activities. Mark Wilkinson's score uses period instruments to create authentic yet unsettling soundscapes. The film's treatment of witch hunt hysteria is complex, the supernatural threat is real, but the community's response reveals how easily fear and righteousness justify cruelty. The youth cult's activities blur the line between demonic possession and adolescent rebellion finding violent outlet. The rural poverty and isolation make the village feel genuinely cut off from civilization, where old evils can resurface unchecked. The Blood on Satan's Claw stands alongside The Wicker Man and Witchfinder General as essential British folk horror, exploring how ancient evil and human cruelty intertwine in isolated communities where faith and superstition remain powerful forces.
Thanks for watching. If you have your own memories of these films or a hidden gem we missed, let us know in the comments below. We're building this collection together, one film at a time. And remember, always be kind and rewind, because every movie is somebody's favorite.